If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, what's something unexplainable that you've experienced? Could be anything: cryptids, aliens, ghosts, etc. One time, when I was a kid in elementary school, I woke up in the middle of the night and felt extremely paranoid. When I looked towards my door, I saw the figure of my mother standing there. Just a black silhouette in my doorway. I called out to her, "Mom," with no answer. She started walking towards me, and I kept calling her over and over with no response. She came up to my bed and bent over, but her silhouette was still all black. I couldn't see her clothing or her face. I then covered the blankets over my head and lay there for a few minutes, too scared to uncover myself. Eventually, when I did, the silhouette was gone, and I was alone again. I swear I was 100% awake and can still feel the fear I felt back then. I have no idea why I saw that. When I was 10-ish, my mother, sister, and I moved into an apartment. 2 beds, 2 baths, but from the start I couldn't handle using the bathroom in the room my sister and I shared. Something just felt wrong in there, like the bathroom was breathing and I was being watched, so I used my mom's. Eventually, my sister refused to sleep in our room at all and moved her mattress into the living room. I got sick a lot during the year we lived there. At night, I sometimes woke to the sound of footsteps approaching my bed from the bathroom, and when I would sit up to look, the sound always stopped. I begged my sister and her friends to keep the bathroom door closed after coming in to use it, but they'd often forget, and I'd wake late at night to a black hole of an open door and that breathing sensation. Eventually, my sister's boyfriend, who often spent the night with her, told her he sometimes saw shadows looming over my bed at night. My religious grandma visited once, stepped into my room, and started speaking tongues. I don't know, it all sounds superstitious and hokey, but that place messed with me until we moved. About 6 years ago, I was at my boyfriend's, now fiancé's, house. He lived in a secluded area down a dirt road. There were other houses, but his property was very private and surrounded by trees, and the houses were not close together. You could only ever see the closest neighbor's house through the trees during the fall and winter after the leaves fell. The house and property never really felt welcoming. I'm not sure how to explain it exactly, but I never enjoyed being outside there, even though it was beautiful and quiet. There was a large deck, but we never used it. There were woods all around the house, and in the woods was a weird pond that the dogs would sometimes play in. I went to the pond only once, just me and the dogs. There was a foot trail to the pond, and while I was walking it, I saw what appeared to be very long human hair on the ground. I thought it was strange but continued to the pond. When I got there, the water was completely black, and I didn't think the dogs should play in it anymore, so I tried to call them back, but they wouldn't come. That was also strange because the dogs were always so well behaved and always came when I called them. I went about my day, not thinking much more about this particular incident, but I still continued to think about the pond and the woods and the strange feeling I got while I was there, but I would always brush it off. Later in our relationship, I ended up moving in with him. It was very dark out there at night, and there were no floodlights. It was a manufactured home that sat on a foundation, and the windows and doors were probably about 8 feet off the ground. We were huge night owls and worked swing shifts, and it was 2 a.m. on a weeknight when this happened. We had the bedroom window open, and it had no screen. We didn't have air conditioning, and we lived in the south at the time, so it was hot during the summer. Anyway, we were just hanging out and had some music playing, and I was sitting on the bed with my legs crossed, back facing the window, and my fiancé was sitting at a small table facing me. Suddenly the hair on my arm stands up and I get goosebumps all over my body. My fiancé randomly stands up, and all I can hear next are footsteps outside, like someone running towards the window and getting close fast. I stood up so fast and screamed. I don't know why I screamed, but I did. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread and fear. By the time I was standing up and had turned around, the curtains were flying around like a strong gust of wind was blowing them, but it was so still and quiet outside that night, and there was no wind. The curtains settled almost immediately, and all was silent again. We both saw it, felt it, and couldn't explain it. We have only talked about it twice, the night it happened and the next day. We've never spoken about it again, and it still scares the snot out of me. I only lived there for 8 months before we moved out of state, but thinking back on it now, I don't think we were ever alone out there. Senior year of high school, I was hanging out with my girlfriend in my room pretty late at night. She says she needs to go upstairs to the bathroom, so she gets up and walks out of the room. About 20 to 30 seconds later, I look towards my door and see what I think is her standing in my doorway. It was super dark, and I could only see the outline of a person in the darkness. My door was opened about a third of the way. I say something like, "I thought you had to pee," That was quick. No answer. I said, "What are you doing just standing there? Come back to bed." Again, no answer. Then I hear footsteps down the stairs and hear, "Why are you standing in the doorway? What are you looking at?" I recognized that her voice was coming from farther away, near the stairs, and not from the figure in the doorway. I responded from my room and said, "I'm not standing up, I'm in bed." She proceeds to the door thinking I'm messing with her, but when she gets there, the figure is gone, and she sees me laying in bed. At this point, I realize she wasn't messing with me either, she really was upstairs before, and the figure wasn't her. The stairs were a pretty significant distance from my doorway, making it easy to distinguish her footsteps and voice from the figure in the doorway. She freaks the duck out and runs in my room, yelling about how I'm such an asshole for standing in the doorway and then somehow getting back into bed super quickly without making any noise. I explain that it wasn't me in the doorway, and she refuses to believe me. I wasn't. This was about a decade ago, and I still have no ducking clue how both of us, at different moments, saw this figure standing in the doorway staring into my room. I'm not a believer in ghosts or whatever, and I don't think it was supernatural, but to this day, it still bothers me that I can't explain what happened that night. It's ongoing. Some time ago, I noticed an irregularity. There's a visual illusion called the strange face phenomenon. Google it if you'd like. The gist is that you get the lights dim and stare at your own face in the mirror, and the brain more or less loses it. Faces are an important thing for our species, making the illusion set in. Some people see a different face, others see enlarged or melting features, and a great deal see fantastic or demonic imagery, to quote a few sources out there. I fall into this latter category, but that's not the irregularity. The illusion itself focuses on the face. People don't usually see anything else. I see something behind me in the mirror. I can only get glimpses in the peripherals because breaking contact ends the illusion and stops the eyes from bleaching. But I always see this big, dark shape with red eyes just over my shoulder. It used to require a great deal of focus, I'd have to get deep into the illusion to see it. But nowadays, not so. I catch sight of it in the reflections in windows or in the glare off my TV. The obvious explanation is hallucination. But I'm not psychotic, I've had my head checked and spoken to a shrink on the matter. There are no drugs to speak of, either. So the next explanation would be an irregularity in the illusion itself. But I haven't found any accounts of these discrepancies anywhere else. Not that my Google foo is incredible or anything. I live in a fairly remote place in the Andean foothills. On a bright, pleasant summer day, I'm outside putting a wooden deck together. Suddenly, I hear this flute. Beautiful, perfect music, clear, no trills. It was 6 notes, a pause, and then again the same 6 notes. It kept repeating. The odd thing was that I couldn't pinpoint the source. I'm surrounded by hills, and the same notes seemed to emanate from all around me. I knew I wasn't imagining it because my 2 dogs were running in circles trying to locate it as well. I wasn't scared or creeped out, I just found it strange because there was nobody else around for miles and the music was quite loud for a single flute. The music started abruptly, lasted about 2 minutes, then slowly rose up towards the sky and faded away. It started when I was a teen and lasted through my mid-20s. I would have these nightmarish episodes and sleep paralysis about 3 or 4 times a year. It was always the same thing. I would see a tall, shadowy figure with no real definable shape, no features, and no details. It was Vanta black in color and never made any noises, but it had the oddest movements though. As if it were poorly filmed stop-motion photography. It didn't always move, either. It would just stand there. Sometimes it would be facing me as if studying me, and other times it seemed to be looking to the side or past me. I would dream at times with my eyes open, visibly take inventory of the things in my room, and at the same time see this thing. There are several dreams, but I'll touch on a few. 15 years old, asleep in an upstairs apartment. It was in the closet on a shelf about the size of a cat. Ran past it and out into the upstairs breezeway, well lit. It was at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at me. This time, about 6 feet tall, solid Vanta black, no sound. 21 years old. I used to drive to the country with my girlfriend and have picnics on the hood of my car. I dreamt of doing this exact thing, but instead she disappeared, and I was driving down the path we took all alone. The picnic blanket and food were still on the hood, and then it just blew off. The sky was overcast, and in the distance to the left of the road by the trees, it was 6 to 7 feet tall now. It was just standing there, and I floored it. As I drove past, I looked back, and it was gone, but in my peripheral vision, I could see it in the back seat, crouching down as if to hide. 22 years old. My apartment got flooded out, and I had to stay with my mom for a while. As I slept on the couch, I had waking sleep paralysis where my eyes were open, and in the darkness I could see her old rocking chair, and yep, there it was again. Except this time, as my eyes adjusted to the dark or low light, it changed its shape to be what I can only describe as a large, 8-foot-tall fetus. It went from banta black to a mixture of dark purple, red, and pink, with large, thick veins that ran through its entire body. I tried to scream but couldn't. I looked down and realized I was also in the fetal position, paralyzed. Somehow I broke through the paralysis and ran down the hallway towards my mom's room like I was a kid again. It was right behind me, like inches away, keeping up with me. The sight of the choppy way it ran and the fact that it was right up on me frightened me so much that I awoke with a loud scream. No. Of course, it woke up my mom, and I was still on the couch. She asked me what was wrong, and I just said, probably stress. She gave me a stress pill, and it helped. Skip ahead to my mid-30s. I hadn't had that recurring dream in many years. One night I awoke just after 3 a.m. and went out to the backyard to have a smoke. Old house, big backyard, and an old shed in the very back. I looked up, and the shed door was wide open, and I could tell there was something in there. Yes, it was a large silhouette, 6 to 7 feet tall. I stood there and couldn't believe it had come back after all these years. I felt paralyzed with fear once more, but this time it was different. This time I felt something else very strongly, anger. I threw my cigarette down hard and just bolted towards the shed as fast as I could run. I can't remember what I was screaming, but it was directed at that thing. As I entered the shed, I suddenly woke up in bed drenched in sweat. This time, I was definitely awake. So I walked out to the garage, grabbed my cigarettes, and lit up. As I walked outside, the shed was wide open, except this time I was wide awake. I casually put my smoke out and walked back inside. As I entered the kitchen, I looked at the clock on the microwave, and it read 3:17 a.m. There are other instances, but nope. The weirdest thing that happened to me was when I was 17 and living with my older brother. He always had a creepy looking house, unkept, dirty, constantly making sounds, etc. It was 1 o'clock at night, and I was extremely thirsty and needed to pee. So I take a piss and come out to the kitchen to make some tea, and I see what looks like a dark shadow creature with red eyes as I am filling the kettle. I look up, and nothing's there. So I continue to make the tea, and again I see the same weird figure. I called out to my brother, who was pissed off for being woken up, to see whether he was pranking me. Nope. He was sound asleep at the other end of the house. I finish and sit up at the kitchen table, drinking my tea, when I feel this ungodly heavy, warm, hot as duck, actually, breathing on my shoulder or neck. I freeze, scared absolutely shitless. Then my brother comes back out almost immediately, complaining about a noise, only to see what I assume is the shadow creature behind me. He yells, "What the duck is that?" and goes to grab his shotgun while I look behind me to find nothing there. I GTFO'd from that house immediately and bunkered in with my parents. That has got to be the single creepiest thing ever. I was a camp counselor during the summers. Each week, a new age group arrives, stays for 6 days, and leaves. The first week of camp is for incoming 4th graders. It's important to understand that none of these kids know each other, and it usually takes about 3 or 4 days for them to really get used to each other and form friendships. On the morning of the 3rd day, 4 of the kids came up to me separately to tell me that they had woken up and seen 3 figures in white robes sitting on the wooden rafters of the cabin. 3 of them were genuinely afraid, and one of them just assumed it was a few of the other counselors playing a prank or something. A fellow counselor told me he had also woken up with a weird feeling. He looked out his window and saw a man in a white robe walking along the shore of the lake at the bottom of the hill, but figured it was the session pastor. It was a Christian camp, out for a midnight stroll. I asked the pastor and other staff members if they had walked by the lake, but none had. A female counselor told me a girl in her cabin woke up and saw another figure in a white robe bending over her bunkmate's bed. Said bunkmate had scratches literally covering her entire left arm. Her cabin had not yet gone into the woods. There are a lot of rural legends passed around at that camp. Cabin 3 is built on a Native American graveyard, and the like, but I really don't know what to make of any of this. I am about 99% sure I was followed, or, God forbid, chased, by some kind of bipedal animal. I say bipedal because it had 2 legs. A 4-legged creature cannot make those kinds of sounds with footsteps. The scariest part? The footsteps were too heavy to belong to a person. Basically, I was running a rural-ish trail in the Bulgarian countryside while visiting family. It was getting dark, and I wanted to jog to a hill I knew about to watch the sunset. Once I started sprinting, I am an avid tennis player, I lost the cracking foliage and footsteps that were being made by whatever was behind me. It took about 5 seconds. I must have gone over 15 miles per hour. I never looked back, for I was scared that I would lose speed or see something that could possibly scar me for life. At this point on the trail or road, I was so far away from my family's villa and my friends and family there that even if I screamed at the top of my lungs, they would never have heard me. I was pretty small then, so if some kind of large predator, angry mama animal, or even some kind of creature caught up to me and attacked me, if it did not kill me, it would have injured me to the point at which I could possibly have died of exposure. If my pursuer that day had malicious intent and it caught up to me, I would most certainly have died. No one would ever have known what happened to me. Remember, this was a pretty rural trail or road. And that is a very, very scary thing to think about. This happened on the last day of school last year. So my classmates are standing outside and saying goodbye and stuff. After a while, almost everyone had left, and there were maybe 5 of us left. I saw my mom in the parking lot, so I said bye to the last people there and walked down the stairs, and suddenly I fell. Then I was on the top of the stairs again, and my friend said, "Oh, look, there is your mom, you should probably go now. Have a great summer." I just stand there confused and say, "But, didn't I just walk down the stairs?" She just looks at me weirdly, and I try to explain what just happened, but she doesn't believe me. To this day, I think of that day from time to time and wonder if I went through a time rift or if I am just crazy. I was walking home one night in the summer, around 10 p.m. The highway I walk down runs through some rural outskirts, and there's forest and a small offshoot of the nearby river, so it's always pretty noisy in the summer with frogs and bugs and occasionally animals, too. While I was walking, just as I reached where the road crosses over the river, everything went quiet. No frogs, no crickets, no cars now. I said this road isn't usually busy, but I'm often passed by at least a few cars. Not this time. Everything was completely silent. I couldn't even hear cars moving further down the road. I pulled out my phone, and there was no cell service. That's not normally a problem here, so it was a bit odd. Switching to airplane mode and back didn't fix the issue either. I was a little weirded out at this point, and I had stopped on the side of the road, and I just waited. Everything stayed silent for what felt like ages. Eventually, I started to hear a car way down the road. It was the only noise, and I waited and waited until I saw it crest the hill and come back down the way I had come. As soon as I saw its headlights, the world was unmuted. My service came back. Everything was normal. It was probably just some weird coincidence, but I'll be damned if it didn't make the hair on my neck stand up. It was very perceptive and smart to stop walking. Had I gone on, I might have been missing forever. Probably in another world or dimension. I grew up in a small town in Georgia, kind of out in the woods. My grandfather had purchased land out there but later moved to some suburbs and left the land to his kids. My uncle got the original house, close to the road. My aunt graveled a driveway quite a ways further onto the property and lived in a trailer there. When I was 6, we moved from Tennessee, and my parents built their dream home on my dad's share of the property, sharing my aunt's driveway but diverting right before her trailer and going even further onto the land. So we were pretty far away from the main road. They built a single-story home, but it was kind of on a hill and had a basement. So there was a back door that led into one of the rooms in the basement, but the rest of it was underground. They always planned on turning the basement into a basement, but it really never got finished. Only the right half of the rooms really had dry walls up, and the 2 left rooms they never dry-walled and my dad used as a workshop area. My dad developed epilepsy and lost his job, but he was doing landscape-type work for this morbidly obese hoarder woman. The woman got evicted from her home, and our unfinished basement, which was already full of old stuff my parents had gotten over the years, became filled with a bunch of her hoarder stuff, because she was paying us to keep it, I guess. All of these things were stored in the large room that the back door opened into. I was somewhere around the age of 12 when this happened. My parents had taken my sister out shopping or something, but the main thing is that I was home alone. I was upstairs watching TV when I got up to use the bathroom. I'm in the hallway, and I hear music coming from somewhere. I finally traced the music to coming from a vent down close to the floor. 12-year-old me knows the ventilation ducting is in the roof of the basement. So I decided to go on an adventure and put a stop to this music. The basement access is right after you go through the front door of the house. It looks almost like a closet, but if you open it, there is a stairwell that leads down and then cuts a 90-degree angle left and continues down. So when you're standing at the top, you can pretty much only see stairs and walls, no basement. I always hated it, and it creeped me out, and that stairwell usually had the only working light, and because you went underground, the basement was always way colder than upstairs. I slowly walked down the lit stairwell into the darkness. When you reach the bottom, It opens up into the left side basement rooms that were unfinished and were my dad's workshop. I peered around the edge of the stairwell and looked down the hallway into the more finished areas. While I'm doing that, I try to turn on the lights because the light switch is right there in the stairwell. Click click, no light. But coming from the big room with all the hoarder stuff in it, there's a glowing green light. I can't not check it out, I have to know. So I go into the darkness, my heart pounding. I make it to the entrance of the room and stand there for a second or two, getting my bearings and trying to figure out where the light is coming from. In the very middle of the room, there's a path cutting through all the junk and they're leading to the back door, and right next to the back door, sitting on some old dressers, is a really old, really big stereo system my dad had picked up. It was playing some radio station or something, with the little green screen causing the weird green glow. I ran in and grabbed the plug and unplugged it real quick because I didn't want to take time in the creepy darkness to try to figure out which button turned it off. I tested the back door real quick, which was always locked, to make sure it was still locked. Then I take off like a demon is right behind me, towards the light of the stairwell, and zip back up the stairs and slam and lock the door to the basement. Take a breath. I laugh at myself for being silly. Go back to watching TV. After a little bit, I decided to go back to my room and get a book I was really interested in. Crossing through the hallway, I heard a sound that made my hair stand up, and my eyes actually started to tear up. I still have zero explanation for it to this day. But there was the music again, drifting up through the vents. I took off running out the front door, ran all the way up the driveway to my uncle's house, and refused to leave until I heard my parents driving down the gravel road returning home. When we got home, I made my dad come and check it out with me. Sure enough, the radio was plugged in again. My dad said maybe I had grabbed one of the other plugs that was lying down near the outlet, but I remember the radio having been the only thing plugged in when I grabbed it. He also said it was probably an electrical issue in the radio that had made it turn on since it was so old. But duck that property and duck that house. I played in the woods all the time and would find old Native American arrowheads. If you climbed through a barbed wire fence and went onto the neighbor's land, there was the foundation of a burnt-out settler home from the 1800s with 3 graves at it. All of my family members had stories about seeing weird stuff in the woods. Both of my parents died in that house, and one of the tenants that rented it after I went to live with my grandparents said they saw my mom. I don't believe in ghost stories and think people make most of that stuff up, including the seeing my mom thing and a lot of the stuff my family saw in the woods. But I know I ducking heard that music, and I know I unplugged that radio. Lived out in the sticks on a small farm in Pennsylvania years ago. Behind our small land was a large farm, but for some reason, about 45 acres or so out at the edge of their property, they had let go, and it had become young woods again. We used to go back there and duck off and hang out since no one was around for miles when I had friends over. One day, me and a buddy were out there late in the afternoon, and from what sounded like 2 hills over from our location, a distinct acoustic guitar or lute solo came on loud and clearly. We both heard it and commented on it. It lasted about 45 seconds to a minute and then just trailed off. We hurried over through the woods to the area, but there was nothing, no footprints, no signs that anyone had ever been there. This spot was not near any roads, train lines, or anything else where it would make sense. We mentioned it together a few times but never figured it out. He died about 5 years ago now, and I still wonder about it. When I was 8, my family and my grandmother were in our summer house that lies in the middle of the woods. The closest town is 50 kilometers away. We go there for about 2 weeks every summer to relax and meet my dad's side of the family. My grandmother had Alzheimer's that had gotten worse since my grandfather died 3 years earlier, when I was 6. Even if she had Alzheimer's, she was the nicest and sweetest grandmother you could think of. She and I were really close, and I love her very much. One day, me and my little sister were in our grandmother's cabin. She had one cabin to herself and her dog, and my family had our own cabin about 100 meters away. After a while, my grandmother said she had to take her dog out for a walk and asked if my sister and I wanted to go with her, but we both said no and walked home to our parents. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. She got lost in the woods. We think she forgot to turn around, and after a couple of weeks, she was declared dead. They were unable to find her body. 2 years later, we are back in our summer house, and I am alone in our family's cabin doing something. I can't remember what, though, and then I look out of the large glass windows and see what looks like a reflection of my grandmother in the window. I'm so shocked that I just stare at the reflection as it raises one hand and waves at me while smiling, like she was waving goodbye, before turning and walking away at the dirt road that is on the other side of the house and can be seen through the large glass windows there. I turn around to see if it was a reflection of my dad I had seen. He and my grandmother looked quite alike, especially at a distance, but as I turn around, the road is empty, no one in sight. I quickly turned back to the glass windows, but my grandmother had disappeared. The rest of my family came back to the house about 5 minutes later. I didn't tell them what I had seen, as I was sure they wouldn't believe me. 2 days after this happened, my grandmother's remains were found in the woods. Today I like to think she said a final goodbye to me, but when it happened, it seriously creeped me out. My friend and I were driving on a road parallel to the Trans-Canada Highway, surrounded by farms. It was about 1 o'clock in the morning, a clear summer night with lots of moonlight, when we realized this thing was in the middle of the road. I say that because I have no idea what it could be. Neither of us noticed it on the road, we thought it was dirt because it wasn't moving. When we got maybe 6 feet away, we saw a shadow and realized something was there. It appeared to be a couple feet tall, sitting on its hind legs, and had large ears that I can only describe as very similar to bat ears. It was covered in short golden blonde, like a golden retriever, hair and had a stubby snout, and the most unnerving part was the giant black, non-reflective eyes. My friend slammed on the brakes, and that thing ran into the long grass in the ditch beside the road. Neither of us had an explanation. We continued driving and went around a corner. This is where things get really weird. About 30 seconds later, we see a pair of headlights come around the corner. My friend is a car buff and likes to guess vehicles, so we were looking at the headlights fairly closely. We noticed there were no yellow or red lights, just headlights. We were driving for about a minute when, I swear I'm not lying, the lights moved vertically on top of each other, and then moved back to their regular headlight position. They did that 2 more times, then disappeared. We stopped at a stop sign and confirmed that we saw the same thing. Being logical people, plus being a first aid attendant and mechanic, we doubled back to see if someone went off the road or if we could have seen a reflection or something, anything to explain what just happened. Nothing, everything was dark, and everything was how it should be. No traces of movement, light, or anything. We booked it home after that. I was 16 and woke up in the middle of the night to see my clothes being rustled about in my doorway. After washing my clothes, I like to hang them dry on my door frame. I notice some really gray, veiny looking legs, and then I see these really long, pointed sticks moving through my clothes. It took me a second, but my sleepy eyes adjusted to see one of the most grotesque demon-looking mother duckers I have ever seen. He was extremely skinny and had a distended stomach. His skin was gray and veiny, and those long sticks were his fingers. His chin was long, and his eyes had no lids on them and were unusually big. His tiny mouth was in a pucker and moved like he was eating an imaginary lollipop. His hunched back looked as though it tore out of the strange hospital gown he was wearing. He just stared at me, and I tried to scream my grandmother awake, who was sharing a room with me for the weekend. He wouldn't stop staring, and I stared back and tried to shake my grandmother awake. I started noticing other things about him, like how large and cone-like his head was and how hairless and shriveled he looked as he stood still, surprised I could see him. My grandmother woke up, looked towards the door, and he was gone. In the weeks leading up to this encounter, I had been experiencing strange things in my house, like my bedroom door slamming and locking on its own. One night I woke up to what felt like several hands touching my feet and legs and horrible nightmares. After my experience with this strange gray man, I told my parents, and they had my room exorcised. I don't know if an exorcism really made those horrible things stop or gave me peace of mind from things I was manifesting myself. All I know is that I don't experience those things anymore, and I'll never sleep with the door open again. About 7 years ago, I was driving through NYS on 17M. As I was passing a wooded area, I saw this thing walking upright into the trees. It had legs as long as my whole body and sort of slouched, but was still at least 7 or 8 feet tall. It was a dark brown color, almost like it was made of wood. It looked like wood. As soon as I saw it, I was overwhelmed with emotion and cried. It was the most involuntary cry I've ever had, and still, when I think about this thing I saw, even right now, I cry. Like a knot in my stomach, I can't fight the tears. It's the only time I have ever seen anything that I can't explain or that I expect people to not believe me. I think about it a lot, and I recently saw an article from Earth is Scary, and it brought back all these weird feelings about seeing this thing. I have referred to it as that stickman I saw, but I could never find more than a few cartoons for stickmen. It has been haunting me for years. What surprises me is that if I think about this creature, even all this time later, I'll cry. Why cry? It wasn't sad, dead, or scary even. One night, me and 2 friends were all walking around at night in the fields around a small town in Michigan. Our destination was a junkyard tucked away behind several fields, home to rusted out cars, semi-trailers, farm equipment, etc. We were cutting through the fields to avoid the trigger-happy farmers that live around there. Just about there, and we were foiled by a stream too wide to leap. It was late autumn, and wet feet would be uncomfortable, so we backtracked into the adjacent field. From our corner of the field, there was a tree line that ran east-west, and southward, the land rose into a large hill. We stood for a moment, discussing our options, when my eyes were drawn to a large white boulder, which seemed to glow a bit in the moonlight. It was around 75 yards away, and I was idly staring at it when it moved. It unfolded, standing up, a 10-12 foot bipedal being, skeletal thin, pure white, with long limbs. For the space of a second, it looked at us, and then it took off. I think it was running, but it may have been gliding or flying, I'm honestly unsure. It crossed the field, up over the hill, a distance of probably 100 yards, in 2 to 3 seconds, in complete silence, and was gone. Only 2 of the 3 of us saw it, and after a few minutes of incoherent gibbering, we tried to rationalize, explain, and figure out what the hell we saw, and we decided it must be an alien. A year later, I was at a party, and the subject of aliens came up. I say, I've seen an alien. And they say, yeah, let me guess, in Saranac, right? I confirm, we exchange mutual looks of awe, and he directs me to this Eric fellow who grew up in said town. Eric tells me that he has seen strange things there his whole life, lights in the sky, etc., but no humanoid beings. Fast forward another year and a half or so, and I get a phone call from an acquaintance who was sitting at work when he noticed a girl staring at him strangely. She eventually walks up to him and says, I feel like I need to talk to you. She proceeds to tell him that her friend's dad is the head of a vampire clan in a town near Saranac. My friend remembers my story about weird things in that area and asks her if she knows anything about Saranac. She gets very defensive and eventually reveals that Saranac is a breeding ground for dragons. Yeah. To this day, I'm not certain if I saw a dragon, an alien, or a vampire, but I did a bit of poking around, and I heard from a girl that lived there as a kid that she had seen random 15-foot scorch marks on roadsides and in the middle of fields. I should begin by saying I'm a painfully rational creature, and nothing even remotely like this has happened to me before or since. At the time this occurred, about 3 years ago, my dad's place was located very near my work, so I would travel down this particular stretch of road pretty much every day. It was a well-lit road leading into the downtown area of a small city, and the river lay on my right, going to my dad's house this particular evening, wending along, dotted by some rather nice properties. I had been driving along, actually singing along to an old song on the radio. I was in fine spirits, going to see my dad, and while the road wasn't deserted, there were few cars along it at the time. All of a sudden, stopping me cold, I felt this wave of emotions crash over me, fear, grief, and a desire to scream, slamming into me like a physical car crash. Time seemed to slow for a moment, the way it does during a surge of adrenaline, and I saw, not 3 feet from my right well, something tall, impossibly thin, and absolutely dark. But it moved. It turned, and I caught just the slightest glimpse of something, a face. I could make out what looked like a beak, short and bent, protruding from beneath a hood. And a word, for a millisecond, one word rang in my head loudly, more like a title than a feeling. Dread. I continued to watch, time still stretched thin, as I passed it, my passenger side mirror coming dangerously close. And as I turned to get a better glance, it was gone. The street lamps hadn't altered once and had shone right where I saw them. I ran the details over and over in my mind and actually turned the car around to examine the spot. My heart was pounding, and I had to turn off the radio. I was covered in goosepimples. But there was nothing there, no tree, no post, or any other viable explanation, to account for what I saw. It felt as real as anything I've ever felt. It felt as though, for a brief moment, another consciousness touched mine to make its presence known. And it felt old. I worked the night shift in a rural area of Arkansas, and most of our service area is mountains and forest. We received a 911 call from an older woman who had found her husband apparently dead. In our area, EMS goes to the scene first, as paramedics have protocols that allow them to confirm death in the field. The location of the call was about 55 minutes deep into the surrounding national forest, which is mostly uninhabited. We follow our GPS until we realize that it no longer shows us our route. The road we are on isn't on any of the paper maps, it's not in the GPS, and we can't find it on our phones. We're in bumfuck nowhere with no GPS, and we can't make contact with dispatch or the sheriff's office on the radio. We decide to go back, but the road is so narrow that the ambulance is scraping against the sides of trees as we try to back up. It's basically an ATV trail. We spend about half an hour with me backing up and my partner guiding me so I don't hit anything. We finally get to an area open enough to turn around and start heading back out the way we came. As we're driving, I notice something on the road. I point it out to my partner as I stop, and the figure moves towards us. It looks like a man dressed in all black. We sit for about half a minute, both of us staring at him and he staring at us, and the whole time we're both going WTF, WTF, WTF. Finally, the figure turns and points down a little side road that we hadn't noticed before because it was dark and it wasn't on the GPS. We try to radio SO or dispatch for police backup and still get no signal, so we decide this must be a neighbor trying to help us find the place and go down the road he pointed down. I'm hearing banjo music in my head. I'm thinking of how many different ways this could get fucked. Why? Because I have been on similar calls before where we find a crazy person that tries to stab us when we approach, or somebody who is methed out of their mind and wants to kill us and take our narcotics. We eventually roll up to a little trailer. We're now over an hour from the nearest highway, and we were later told that dispatch was flipping out trying to make contact with us because they couldn't even find our satellite tracker on the map. We slowly approach, go inside, and find an elderly woman sitting on the floor next to a body. The body is the same size and build as the figure that pointed us to the house. We feel the body, and it's rigor mortis, meaning he's been dead for at least a few hours. We console the woman for a moment and ask if she has any neighbors. She says her nearest neighbor is a house that we passed about 7 miles back the way we came. We confirm the woman's death and ask the woman if she has a telephone, and we use her landline to call the sheriff's office to get the county coroner and officers to investigate. Once they show up, we ask if they met the man we met. They say no. They just followed our tire tracks in the mud. My partner and I got the foo-K out of there. We never talked about it again. I still get shivers every time we have to go into the forest. I was out at our cabin in the remote mountainous wilderness of Colorado with my dad and had to use the bathroom in the middle of the night. This necessitated a flashlight and shoes because the outhouse was far away. There was no one but me and my dad for miles in any direction. So I thought. I suddenly heard voices in the distance and stopped in my tracks. It seemed to be coming from my right, deep in the woods in the middle of nowhere, a quarter of a mile from the road. Being 11 and unafraid of the world, I foolishly yelled, "Who's out there?" There was silence for a few seconds, then a shouted string of profanity so vulgar it terrified my virgin ears. I stood stock still for a moment like a terrified rabbit but heard nothing else, so I ran back to the house and woke my dad up. He got up, loaded his gun, and turned all the lights on, but we never heard another sound. To this day, we have not seen or heard another person within 15 miles of the cabin. My family lives in a super rural part of East Tennessee, and we have a family homestead that's been passed down for generations called the Turley House. The legend in the family has it that it was a Civil War hospital, which I can totally see because it's absolutely ancient and creepy. We also have a legend in the family that we're all haunted by a demon, spirit, or God knows what called Wool Eyes. He's so prominent in our family's history that he's just a fact of life at this point, so it's not unusual to hear somebody say something like, "Oh look, Wool Eyes is at it again. He must be upset." One of the creepy experiences I had growing up here was the never-ending rosebush. There were 2 rose bushes on the corner of the house that weren't very big. I have some distinct memories of playing around them and getting absolutely batshit lost in the rose bushes, running in circles for hours at a time. It was sort of like that scene in Spirited Away when Chihiro and Haku are running through the flower hedges. Eventually I would find my way out, but it would be hours later, and my mom would be hella angry that I was gone for so long. I never really thought much of it because of kid logic, but I asked my mom about it years later, and she said that all the kids in the family have stories about getting lost in the same spot. Everybody always blamed it on Wool Eyes, saying he was just having fun messing around. I wish I could go back and explore the house some. It's had some crazy stories through the years. I've seen a lot of paranormal things and had a bunch of unexplained experiences. The one that takes the cake for me is what my fiancé and I call the blackout. We were sitting in his living room one night back at his then stepdad's house. Everyone was out at a family friend's house, and we were just chilling, about to grab a bite to eat and then go back into his room. He turns on the TV, and we get distracted on the way to retrieve our pizza rolls, so we sit down in the living room for a hot second. Then the freaky shit starts. We hear this noise, which I can only describe as a mix of a dog howling and a woman crying. Mind you, the nearest neighbor is probably a mile on either side, and no dogs come near our house except our own, which doesn't sound like that. Dogs have voices, and as wasn't this. I'm a little worn out, and I glance at the glass door leading straight from the living room to the back porch and notice a reflection of what looks like a person standing in the open bathroom door across the way. Duck that, number one. I whip my head around. Nobody's there. Both of us are spooked. We go to get food and calm down a bit since we get a little paranoid due to past experience anyway. Well, duck our pizza rolls, I guess, because the lights in the house go out. They don't just switch off, either. It's an eerie fade, like something gradually sucked out the electricity. Duck that number 2. I get paranoid because I feel like I heard something in the spare room by the kitchen, and I grab a sharp object while he walks up with a light behind me. We check the breaker to see if we can fix it. Nope. On. Off. Nothing. So it's something else. We figure it'll get fixed when stepdad is home. He didn't think of a street-wide issue because his house wiring was ass. By that moment, the noises had stopped, or at least I didn't hear them anymore. Okay. Then we go into his bedroom. There's a window on the far wall that you see through directly onto the porch, and it's somewhat large with a moderately sheer curtain in front of it. I was the first to go into the room, so of course I see what I do because duck me, right? I walk into his room and instantly lock gaze with a pair of huge, reflective eyes staring straight at me from the porch. Like human height, too big to make sense, and looking at me like I'm a whole snack. Duck that number 3. I panicked and ducked entirely off into the corner, and shortly after that, the power came back on. Turns out, we learned the next day that the whole road had a blackout that night. I am convinced it was not just a neighborhood electricity issue. It's one of the many experiences that means I will never spend another night in that house, as nice as the people who live there are. I'll stick to daytime visits. When I was about 7 or 8, I went to my grandma's house for Christmas and caught the flu. Every time we went, either I would get sick or my mom would get sick. It got so bad that my mom stopped going whenever we went. Anyway, I was sick, so I was put to sleep in one of the guest rooms that had a bunch of troll dolls, the ones with the pointy hair and the jewel belly button, inside. I remember being awake and just sort of watching the dolls. I wasn't afraid of them, but I couldn't exactly fall asleep, so I was just looking mostly in their direction. Slowly, one started to move. Just a hand at first. Then a wobbled step. Gently and silently, I watched as the dolls woke up and started a weird kind of dance. They would spin awkwardly in a circle, like a dossy-do kind of dance. Every turn, they would stop and bow to each other. I felt that if I moved, they would notice me, so I just stayed still. They didn't scare me, but I remember being uncomfortable and confused. After a few minutes, they quit the dance and went back to their places. I got up and almost told my parents, but even then I knew they wouldn't believe me if I did, so I went to another room to sleep. I never saw this again, and the dolls were shortly thereafter removed from the room, and I've never asked about them since. Of course, this was likely a fever dream, but in my memory, it's more clear than any dream I've ever had. I was 10 or 11, and I lived in the middle of nowhere. My mom and I were driving back home after dropping my friend off at home. She lived down a long dirt road with some sort of crop fields on both sides. My mom and I stopped and turned the car off to look up at the night sky in the pitch dark. We were staring up for a while, each of us standing outside the car on our respective sides, but I got the feeling someone was watching me. I look over into the field, and there is a dark figure of a man walking towards us with a sickle in his hand. He was walking with a slight limp, and I could see him stretching his arm out so the sickle was facing out. I've never gotten in a car so fast. I started honking the horn, and my mom jumped in, and we drove off. Growing up, I had an acquaintance we'll call M. We went to the same church and the same school, but I was 2 years older than M, and when you're 5, that's a world of difference. I was aware of M's existence the same way I was aware of the sun. You know it's warm, but you don't really look at it. So I happily passed through high school without thinking much of M as a person of interest in my life. But then I was 28, having gone to college, and I loved and worked just like everyone else, until I had a dream. I was sitting on a bus next to a woman. She was older than I remembered, her dark hair was streaked with gray and shorter than it had been when I last saw her. It must have been 20 years since I'd seen M's mother, but it was her, wearing a pair of dark slacks and a crimson sweater with a button fixed to one shoulder. The bus was old and smelled odd, its vinyl seats creaking when it stuttered and screeched to a halt on the side of the road. In my dream, I stood up, but someone on the other side of M's mother made me stand too, and it was M herself. I took her hand, and we walked off the bus. Turning around, I saw M's mother give a shallow wave as the doors hissed closed and the bus roared away from the curb and motored down the street. I blinked awake, and it was around 6:30 a.m. I couldn't go back to sleep because the dream was so vivid. After a shower and a coffee, I picked up my phone and checked my social media. A friend of a friend of a friend had posted that M's mother had died that morning after an elective surgery gone wrong that lasted most of the night. Maybe it could have been coincidence, or déjà vu, or whatever mental exercise my mind needed to go through that morning. Maybe something had triggered it in those days leading up to it. I don't know what it was, but it messed me up that morning. I couldn't even send my condolences the same way all my friends had done. I honestly just wanted to ignore it. Then, 2 days later, I was filling up my gas tank at pump number 7, and I saw her, at pump number 3, come home to take care of her mother's affairs. She was wearing a pair of black jeans paired with a deep red sweater and an ivory-colored button holding the sides of one shoulder together. It's honestly hard to explain what happened next. The awkward hellos that led to long coffee dates. Is moving home from the big city and moving into her mother's house. The first time I held her hand, it felt just like in the dream. We married 2 years later, and I never told her about what I saw on the bus. I didn't want to sound crazy. Honestly, for a long time, I forgot about it until we got a cat. The cat had a habit of staring for hours at one corner every night. Maybe he sees a ghost, I said it idly. And then we had a long conversation about the possibility of ghosts, spirits, or whatever. I thought a lot about her mother. Can I tell you something strange? Said, the night my mother died, I had a dream, and you were holding my hand. You don't have to believe that this actually happened to me. I'll believe it for you because it happened to me. There are things that I can't explain in this life. But I know that the night I dreamed of my future mother-in-law, deceased, on a bus, it shot my life in a direction I never knew existed. And I'm so ducking grateful it happened. At my parents' house, there is a mirror in my basement that has just always been there. When I was about 6, I would have a recurring experience where I would see a pale figure in a navy blue cadet outfit out of the corner of my eye in that mirror. This happened at least a dozen times, but the figure would always fade away after a second. I never felt threatened or scared, so I never mentioned it to my parents. So after a year or two, these experiences stopped, and I sort of forgot about them. One day, 10 years later, a local historian stopped by my house and talked to my parents for a little while. He explained that he was researching local World War II veterans, and apparently one of the first casualties at Pearl Harbor was a Navy sailor that grew up in my house in the Zeros. The historian said he would come back with more information, but we never saw him again. I've had my fair share of unexplained events, but this one has definitely stuck with me the most. The basement mirror is still there, and I still get a little uncomfortable when I see it. When I was a kid, I was convinced I saw an alien spying on me. It was when I was maybe 7-ish. I was laying in bed awake when I looked over and saw this weird, hairy creature hunched over and staring into my room through the crack in my door. It was built mostly like a man, 2 arms, 2 legs, 1 head, etc., but was completely covered in long brown fur and had glowing yellow eyes. Think Chewbacca, except his face is completely covered by hair, so the only features you can make out are the glowing eyes. It just crouched there looking at me until I hid under my blanket for a while, then was gone when I worked up the courage to look again. I didn't know what it was, and even at that age, I had decided the next morning that I was just dreaming or something, even though it didn't feel like a dream at all. But within a few days, I checked out a book about supposedly true alien encounters from the school library, not because of what I saw, which I didn't even think of as an alien, I just liked alien stories, and nearly flipped my lid when I got to a story about someone having an encounter with aliens that looked exactly like the thing I had seen. To this day, as an adult, I wonder about it. It's easy to brush it off as being the result of an overactive imagination, and 95% of the time that's what I think of it as. But there's still that 5% that's weirded out by finding this other story that describes exactly what I saw. I was playing hide and seek up at my family's cabin outside when I was like 8. I was the youngest of the cousins and was always left behind. I decided I was going to cheat and peek through my eyes when I was counting. I saw what I thought was one of my cousins. We were all wearing the same family reunion shirt, take off towards the lake, so when time was up, I followed. Sure enough, I could see my cousin standing behind our boathouse. I snuck up behind her and yelled, "Gotcha!" When she turned around, it was me. But it wasn't me, it was like seeing a version of yourself in the front camera or something. Mirrored. I screamed and fell over, and I actually ended up cutting my hand pretty badly on some of the sharp rocks that peppered our yard while trying to scramble away. Then my cousin, it was actually my cousin, back to her normal self, ran to get help. I ended up getting everyone in trouble for playing by the water, and when I told my mom what happened, she thought I was sleep deprived and made me sleep in their room the rest of the trip. I kind of brushed it off, but as an adult now, I still remember it so vividly. It almost makes me feel sick just to think about or type it out. I wonder if I had some type of seizure or something. One time, my wife and I experienced several glitches in the Matrix, all within a couple of days together. Some together, some separately. The big one that scares both of us is that one day she and I were desperately trying to find our window AC unit's remote control to make the living room cooler. We were both searching and decided to check under the couch together. Right as I was about to turn the flashlight on my phone on, a friend called, and I picked up, and he said he was outside, so I immediately left the apartment to go downstairs and say hi. The creepy part that my wife swears upon is that instead of me getting that phone call when I did, in my reality, in hers, I turned the flashlight on, looked under the couch with her, and we found it together and celebrated. Then my friend called, and I went outside. When the real me came back in, I saw the air was running, so I asked her where the controller was. She gave me an annoyed look and was like, "What do you mean, where was it? You are the one who helped me find it just a few minutes ago." I'm sure I probably went completely white as I explained to her that, no, I received that phone call sooner than she is claiming and was outside with my friend the entire time. I even showed her the call log timestamp. She's the one that then went white, and she swears on her ducking life that I helped her find the remote and didn't go outside or get the phone call until after we celebrated finding it. We were both so creeped out and confused that we had to stop talking about it. It was making both of our hair stand on end and give us goosebumps, and we felt like we were losing our minds or something. We are both adamant that the reality we individually experienced is the real one. So neither of us knows who that person was who looked and acted just like me while I was actually outside the entire time. Definitely some sort of scary glitch. After that, we each had a handful of other terrifying glitches happen to us both separately and together not long after this experience, but they stopped after a few days. It was like we messed up the programming, or due to that one glitch, it caused a butterfly effect of more glitches until the universe settled back into where everything should be for everyone. It was creepy as duck, but also really cool and intriguing.